In 1980, John Nathan Turner began his journey as the longest-serving producer of classic Doctor Who, beginning with season 18. With dissatisfaction from the previous regime, he set about his new broom philosophy by refreshing and updating the show from top to bottom, in particular in music, image, writing, and ultimately the cast. Throughout the season, Nathan Turner refreshed the lead characters, starting with the writing out of Romana and K9, and bringing in Adric, Nyssa and Tegan. The final and most important change was the Doctor himself, with Tom Baker stepping down from the role and being arguably the most popular incarnation of the Time Lord to date. His replacement would be 30-year-old actor Peter Davison. Succeeding the ever-popular Tom Baker was always going to be a tall order, but upon reflection, how well did Peter Davison put his stamp on the role, and where does the Fifth Doctor era stand in the history of Doctor Who? Let's navigate our way through Peter Davison's time as the Doctor in the TARDIS. When Tom Baker announced his intention to leave the show, John Nathan Turner decided that his successor needed to be a physical contrast to the Fourth Doctor, already a household name to assist in audience recognition. The ideal candidate to fulfill the role would be Peter Davison, who became recognisable with his role as Tristan Farnon in another BBC hit show, All Creatures Great and Small, in which John Nathan Turner also worked on as a production manager. Going in the complete opposite direction of the previous Doctor's appearance and persona was nothing new, and you only need to look at the previous four actors to see this. It's a brilliant way of marking the end of the predecessor's reign and laying down a marker in taking the show in a new direction. However, this time the contrasting incarnations of the Doctor could arguably have not been greater. Whereas the Fourth Doctor was bohemian in appearance, complete with an erratic yet whimsical persona, the Fifth Doctor was more youthful in appearance, complete with a more reserved appearance consisting of a frock coat and cricket regalia, coupled with a vulnerable, indecisive persona that reflected Davison's youthful appearance. Despite the persona, the Fifth Doctor still possessed the values of the wise, well-travelled Time Lord. Initially joining the Fifth Doctor would be the youthful companions who were all introduced towards the end of the Fourth Doctor era, and all had troubled backgrounds and saw the TARDIS as a sort of sanctuary. Adric, the artful Dodger-type character with a talent of mathematics, boarded the TARDIS following the death of his brother at the conclusion of the story Full Circle. He initially acted as a sort of apprentice to the Fourth Doctor, however this would change with the different persona of the Fifth Doctor, and the involvement of the other two companions, leading to Adric becoming more rebellious as he strived for attention from who he perceived as his mentor. Then you have Nyssa, the young scientist from Traken, who became a permanent member of the TARDIS following the Master murdering and taking over the body of her father, and his actions leading to her witness her home planet become consumed by entropy. Quiet and level-headed, she comes across as the linchpin and most understanding of the three companions. Finally, you have the Australian air hostess Tegan Javanka, who, while en route to her first day in her job, stumbles across the TARDIS in search of help, with her aunt becoming another one of the Master's victims when she follows her niece. Hot-headed, outspoken and brash in nature, she comes across as the only one of the three companions who doesn't actually want to be there. For season 19 and ultimately the majority of the Peter Davison era, Doctor Who would find itself under a new schedule, which for the first time took Doctor Who away from its standard Saturday night evening slot and replaced with two midweek slots. This would mean that the season would be broadcast in half the time in regards to the number of weeks on TV, but with 2 episodes per week, audiences would only have to wait 24 hours instead of 1 week for the following episode. The Fifth Doctor made his full debut in the story Castrovalva, which completed a trilogy of stories chronicling the Master's return, which are now being played by Anthony Ainley. A large part of the story is actually set within the TARDIS, and with a trap set up by the Master, Adric disappears and is the companion detached from the main characters, despite his important role with him being used by the Master to use his mathematical skills and theory of block transfer computation that was picked up from the Fourth Doctor story Logopolis to create the peaceful city of Castrovalva, which in reality is another trap set up by the Master to defeat a weakened Doctor. Post-regeneration trauma had now become a standard in Doctor debut stories. However, for Castrovalva, it is prolonged across the majority of the story, resulting in the Doctor acting erratic and being vulnerable, which in turn goes on to establish his character, discover the secret of Castrovalva. By the story's conclusion, however, you are finally presented with the finished article of the Fifth Doctor and the direction his character is heading in, and the importance his companions would play in that development. However, John Nathan Turner wanted to increase the vulnerability of the Fifth Doctor than just being with the character, and in the Visitation, He did just that. Set in 1666, in the days leading up to the Great Fire of London, the Doctor finds himself up against a group of fugitive pterodactyls who plan to devastate Earth's population and make the planet their new home. A steady story, albeit with an often used basic narrative, it features an important scene when the Doctor's trusted sonic screwdriver is destroyed. This symbolic moment removes the Doctor's ability to lean on his trusted device as a means to escape out of seemingly impossible scenarios. This is something that John Nathan Turner perceived as lazy writing, and with the removal of the device from Doctor Who after being included for almost 15 years, it meant that the Doctor would need to use his wits somewhat more to escape these impossible scenarios. It is also fitting that The Visitation was written by Eric Saward, who by the end of season 19 would replace Anthony Root as script editor, and no doubt shared these notions of John Nathan Turner of having the Fifth Doctor being more inventive than maybe in his predecessors. The crowded TARDIS results in season 19 featuring prolonged scenes in the time machine, which explored the conflicts between the four characters. Although the Doctor would always be the lead character over the course of the season, Adric, Nyssa and Tegan would also find themselves central to a story, whilst on the flip side they also might find themselves redundant in a story with very little to do. The season's third story, Kinder, sees Nyssa virtually absent for the entirety of the story, which was partially down to actress Sarah Sutton's contract. What it did allow, though, was for Tegan to get her focused storyline with the introduction of the antagonist Namara, who Tegan interacts with whilst in a dreamlike state, in the form of lucid nightmares which are intriguing and very surreal for Doctor Who narratives, but are very well written by Davison and Christopher Bailey. Eventually, Tegan's actions release the Mara into a physical manifestation of a giant snake that attacks the natives of the planet Devaloka, and in the meantime the Doctor and Adric have become embroiled with a human research team, with their leader suddenly becoming unhinged and dangerous. Kinder also progresses Adric's rebellious nature as he naively tries to fix situations of his own accord, which risks making the situation worse. John Nathan Turner was always keen on reaching into the show's history, and went a long way to establish continuity. However, all that is mainly to do with narrative and characters, but with season 19, Nathan Turner commissioned the first pure historical story since 1966, The Highlanders, with the two-parter Black Orchid. Set in the 1920s, it revolves around mistaken identity, with the Doctor falsely accused of murder during a fancy dress party, and with the theory of doppelgangers, with Nyssa looking identical to another character, which gives not only her character, but actress Sarah Sutton their moment to shine on Doctor Who. If season 19 over time set about establishing the character of the Fifth Doctor and his relationships with his three companions, then the story that brings it all to a crescendo will be the season's penultimate story, Earthshock, a title that certainly fulfilled the promise with its narrative content. As mentioned earlier, Adric's relationship with the Doctor during his fourth incarnation had been a master and apprentice setup, but with the introduction of the Fifth Doctor, coupled with the arrival of Nyssa and Tegan, it saw a gradual disintegration in the original relationship between the Doctor and Adric, with the young companion at various moments during the season attempting to take matters into his own hands. By the time he reached Earthshock, the changing relationship between the Adric and Doctor had taken its toll, with the two arguing and Adric declaring that he wants to return to his own people in the pocket universe of E-Space. Although the two later reconcile, it sets up a scenario that will play a major role in the narrative's conclusion. As for the story itself, before its broadcast, John Nathan Turner went to great lengths to prevent certain elements in the narrative hidden from the public, in order to establish the shock value that the title attempts to deliver. From the off, the story takes a dark turn, beginning with a team of troopers investigating the disappearance of scientists in a cave system. Before too long, some of the troopers are killed off in gruesome ways by two featureless androids. The shadowy setting and implied violence and murders feels like a throwback to the early years of the Tom Baker era. The eventual operators of the androids turn out to be Cybermen, who make their first appearance since 1975's Revenge of the Cybermen. After the Doctor helps the troopers defeat the androids and disarm a bomb that they were protecting, the narrative moves on to a space freighter, as the violence and gruesome deaths carry on as the Cybermen put into motion their plan B of destroying Earth. As they eventually make their presence known, they establish a total control of events, with the Doctor, along with Adric by his side, finding himself helpless to prevent matters. In the end, the Cybermen's decision to leave Adric on the freighter as they program it to crash into and destroy the Earth turns out to be their downfall. The companion, who at times incorrectly tried to take matters into his own hands, starts to break down the Cybermen's program to take the freighter back in time, with the Cyber leader killed on board the TARDIS by the Doctor. The Time Lord, together with Tegan and Nyssa, Watch on as Adric is unable to stop the freighter crashing into Earth, resulting in his death, with his actions saving humanity and in turn wiping out the dinosaurs. This brings forward the Doctor's sadness and guilt at the needless argument with his companion at the start of the story, and although Adric has never been the most highly thought of her companions, his unexpected death, and the first of a companion since the first Doctor story, The Dalek's Master Plan, immortalises his place in Doctor Who folklore. Earthshock is seemingly a story that would only work for the Fifth Doctor, as his vulnerability and indecisiveness is fully exposed and his helplessness to stop the Cybermen removes from the audience the comfort of that expectation that the Doctor can ultimately save the day, and in this case it was only achieved with a great sacrifice. As a result, Earthshock typifies the Fifth Doctor era, and is arguably one of its strongest stories, and instills that uncertainty with audience and companions alike. Where Earthshock represents the best of the Fifth Doctor era, you could argue that Season 19's finale, Time Flight, highlights some of the worst factors of that era. An ambitious story that features extensive use of Concorde coupled with a plot of the Master bringing passengers and crew back to prehistoric times as he aims to repair the TARDIS with the assistance of an alien race. As with many a Doctor Who story of the classic series, a lack of budget can hamper the quality of a story, in particular that has an inconsistent narrative, which is what we get with Time Flight. At the end of the story, Tegan is left behind on present-day Earth by the Doctor and Nyssa, although this would only be a temporary measure. Despite the lacklustre finale, Season 19 is one of the strongest series of the 1980s, and delivers in setting the characteristics of the Fifth Doctor, in particular with Castrovalva and Earthshock, as well as juggling with three companions fighting over screen time, and being the main companion over across various stories. Sacrifices to establish characters, in this case Adric, go a long way to underline the fact that despite all his good intentions, the Doctor is far from perfect, and his actions can lead to his companions being in peril that he can't always save them from. This will be a pattern that will continue in various shapes and forms throughout the tenure. 1983 Season 20 was naturally all going to be about Doctor Who's 20th birthday, and something producer John Nathan Turner didn't want the show to miss out on. With the promise of a 20th anniversary special later in the year, Nathan Turner used Season 20 to reach far and near into the history of the show, with every story featuring a returning antagonist. Also included, there was to be a story arc trilogy, one companion departure, two new companions joining, and the return of an old friend of the Doctor's. Having left Tegan behind on Earth at the conclusion of Time Flight, it didn't take long for the Doctor and Nyssa to be reunited with the Australian with the season opener, Arc of Infinity. Partially set on both Gallifrey and Earth, it features the return of the ancient Time Lord engineer Omega, who was last seen in Season 10's The Three Doctors, as he attempts to bond with the Doctor so he can once again exist within our universe. Other nice touches is the location shooting in the story taking place in Amsterdam, with Doctor Who being filmed outside of the UK for the first time since 1979's City of Death. Also, you had the reoccurring character of the Doctor's former teacher, Baruza, making his third appearance in the show in the position of Lord President of Gallifrey, as well as the introduction of the Castellan character, both of whom would reappear in the Five Doctors later on in the year. One more slight but significant footnote is the appearance of the character Commander Maxil, played by none other than future Sixth Doctor Colin Baker. Snake Dance features the return of the Mara, who appeared in the previous season story Kinder, and once again actress Janet Fielding gets to spread her acting wings as Tegan gets possessed by the snake-like entity once more. Although the plot is similar to Kinder, it once again has some noteworthy touches in regards to guest appearances, in particular Sarah Jane Smith actress Elizabeth Sladen's husband Brian Miller appearing as the character Dugdale, and an early acting role from Martin Clunes playing the character of Lon. The next three stories form the story arc of the Black Guardian trilogy, which saw the return of the aforementioned antagonist who last appeared in the Fourth Doctor's Key to Time season, as he seeks revenge on the Doctor by convincing an alien exile living on Earth named Vizsla Turlo to assassinate the Time Lord on his behalf in exchange for a passage off the planet. In a similar vein to Adric, there is a degree of arrogance and distrust with Turlo, given what he has been tasked to do, as he joins the TARDIS crew and eventually finds himself in a personal dilemma in his attempts to kill the Time Lord, who has now taken him under his wing. The first story of the trilogy, Mordrin Undead, introduces us to Turlo, as he lives life on Earth as a public schoolboy, and amongst the teachers is none other than Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, who is now teaching maths after leaving unit. If the idea of the Brigadier being a teacher seems a little out of character, It is because the original idea was to have an early companion, Ian Chesterton, who was a science teacher, fulfilling the role. However, actor William Russell was unavailable, leading to Brigadier actor Nicholas Courtney to step in. The second story of the trilogy, Terminus, starts off with Turlough sabotaging the TARDIS, but focuses mostly on Nyssa, with the character opting to leave at the end of the story to stay on the Terminus ship to use her scientific skills to refine a cure for the leprosy-like Lazarus disease, which she nearly succumbed to. The final story of the trilogy is Enlightenment, which was the first story to be written by a woman in Barbara Clegg. The story itself is one of the most inventive narratives in Doctor Who history, with the Doctor, Tegan and Turlough finding themselves on board what they think is an Edwardian sailing yacht, but is in fact a spaceship taking part in a race run by beings known as Eternals, and with Enlightenment being their prize. To conclude the story and the trilogy, Turlough is left to make a choice of siding with the Doctor or betraying him and taking Enlightenment as the prize for himself. As you can expect, he ultimately sides with the Doctor, which he's been slowly leaning to over the past 3 stories, by throwing a physical representation of Enlightenment at the Black Guardian and thus banishing him. With the Black Guardian gone, the White Guardian reveals to Turlough that Enlightenment was the choice he had to make in regards to siding with or betraying the Doctor. Now free of the Black Guardian, Turlough asks the Doctor if he can carry on travelling with the Time Lord, which carries on the tradition of the 5th Doctor taking on companions who are emotionally troubled or damaged. With the Black Guardian trilogy now complete, the season technically ends with the 2-part story, The King's Demons. A low-key story, it features the Master using the android Chameleon impersonating King John to influence the outcome of the signing of the Magna Carta. A plot that even the Doctor admits isn't really like the Master. Unlike the previous season finale Time Flight, it seems to be another disappointing finale to the season, and the key element of the narrative tends to centre around the android Chameleon, who the Doctor manages to possess control of from the Master, and ends up joining the TARDIS team. Given John Nathan Turner's dislike of previous robotic companion K9, it's a surprise that he pushed for the inclusion of Chameleon, and although an interesting concept, the prop itself immediately became problematic due to its creator passing away and not getting round to finalising the set of instructions, leaving the prop itself redundant and only used one more time during the following season's story, Planet of Fire. Despite being an android, Chameleon also carries on the trend of companions being troubled, with it being susceptible to the Master's control. With Season 19 having set about establishing the characteristics of the 5th Doctor and the role the companions contribute to this, Season 20 feels more focused on the celebration of Doctor Who itself, with the inclusion of returning antagonists and friends, and it feels at times like a prelude to the 20th anniversary story, The 5 Doctors, which would occur later in the year. The stories are a bit middle of the road, and I wouldn't look at any of being one of the all-time greats, although in my opinion Enlightenment is one of the most unique and stylish stories of the era. I feel Nyssa's departure is well timed and it makes sense of carrying on with Tegan, with her being the only human companion, which draws back on the successful formula of the companion acting as the audience representation. Turlough is an interesting concept with his initial desire to kill the Doctor in exchange for his freedom. However, with the Time Lord never seemingly being able to trust him, he cuts a polarising figure, leaning into fan uncertainty, akin to a similar viewpoint of Adric, given the underlying similarities with the other troubled companion. Episode 2 of The King's Demons was broadcast on the 16th of March 1983, which brought Season 20 to a conclusion. Thoughts then moved on to the 20th anniversary special, The 5 Doctors, which was commissioned to be broadcast in late November to coincide with the show's birthday. The idea of a multiple Doctor story first occurred with The 3 Doctors, which opened up Season 10, and was originally broadcast from late 1972 into early 1973, and didn't actually coincide with the 10th anniversary. Former script editor Terence Dix came in and wrote the story after another veteran writer, Robert Holmes, turned down the opportunity. For a director, John Nathan Turner originally reached out to Waris Hussein, who directed the very first story in Unearthly Child in 1963, but he was in America at the time and unable to commit. Second choice was another veteran director, Douglas Canfield, who was too ill at the time, and in the end, John Nathan Turner went with Peter Moffat, who previously directed State of Decay, The Visitation and Mordred Undead, as well as having worked with Nathan Turner and Peter Davison on All Creatures Great and Small prior to Doctor Who. The story was designed to be a celebration of Doctor Who in a single 90-minute episode. Intended to feature all 5 Doctors, the first problem came with the first Doctor, given that William Hartnell had passed away back in 1975. Veteran actor Richard Hurndall was picked to step in and play the role of the Doctor's first incarnation. However, William Hartnell briefly appears with the use of archived footage taken from the Dalek invasion of Earth, which acts as a pre-title introduction. One further problem was that Tom Baker, who had left the role only 2 years previous, turned down the chance to return as he felt it was too soon since his departure. To compensate for this, footage was used from the incomplete story Sharda that was originally intended for season 17. Although it is unfortunate Tom Baker didn't properly feature in the 5 Doctors, his reduced screen time meant Richard Hurndall and Peter Davison, together with second and third Doctors Patrick Troughton and John Pertwee, would have more time into what would turn out to be a heavily crowded story. To complement the returning Doctors, the story would feature the return of Susan, the Brigadier, Sarah Jane Smith, K9, and Romana, albeit from the Sharda footage, featuring alongside regular companions Tegan and Turlough, as well as Liz Shaw, Mike Yates, Jamie and Zoe, all appearing as apparitions. No story would be complete without classic antagonists, and once more the 5 Doctors didn't disappoint, with a Dalek, the Master, Cybermen and a Yeti, complete with a Raston warrior robot, all appearing. Set on both the capital and the Forbidden Death Zone on Gallifrey, the basic narrative features the Doctors journeying to the tomb of Rassilon to discover the reason why they have been taken out of their own time streams to play this deadly game against their enemies. Never intended to be challenging to the audience, the 5 Doctors sets out all it intends to achieve: a fun celebration of Doctor Who, and acknowledging the show's past and then present. Although John Nathan Turner rarely depended on writers who had contributed to the show prior to his arrival, the choice of Terrance Dicks to write the story was a masterstroke in putting this story in the hands of someone who had had a long-term, deep involvement in the show and fully understood the history and continuity of Doctor Who. In 1983, Peter Davison made the announcement that he was to leave the role after the upcoming season 21. This was following on from advice from Patrick Troughton to move on after 3 years to avoid being typecast, something Troughton did himself. Season 21 would be designed as a means of winding down the 5th Doctor era with companion departures as well as preparing for the 6th Doctor with another companion introduction and the beginnings of the narrative taking a darker, more violent tone. The final approach to season 21 would be that the 5th Doctor's final adventure would be the penultimate story of the season, with the 6th Doctor's debut being the finale. This would be the first time that the Doctor would regenerate during the season as opposed to the end, since the 1st Doctor regenerated into the 2nd during season 4. The season would open with Warriors of the Deep, which on paper has all the hallmarks of a classic. The return of both the Silurians and the Sea Devils, it's set on an isolated sea base, and a narrative that uses the classic base under siege structure, coupled with Cold War allegories that was ongoing during the time, albeit set on the future Earth. In reality, the realisation was far removed from the initial ideas that writer Johnny Byrne had envisioned. A bright set representing the ocean base doesn't give the impression of isolation, and you feel an approach similar to Earthshock, with the sets being dark, shadowy, and complete with a run-down look would have been more fitting, setting in the narrative tension. You also have the dreaded Merca, which was built up throughout the story as the formidable beast of the Silurians, but due to budget and timing issues, it comes across more as a reptilian pantomime horse, and ultimately has become one of the figureheads of the criticisms of Doctor Who when it comes to budget management. In the end, Warriors of the Deep, you feel, could have slotted easily into the darker tone the show was aiming for had it been visually better realised. Fortunately, the season would improve. Not all of season 21 stories would follow this darker tone twist, and the second story of the season, The Awakening, is one of those examples. The story is the customary two-parter that become a staple of the 5th Doctor era, with a narrative that complements its allotted episodes comprising of an alien known as the Malice, feeding off the psychic energy of some villagers reenacting a Civil War battle for real. The following story, Frontiers, is one of the stronger examples of this period of Doctor Who set in a darker tone. Set on the aforementioned planet, it features a human colony struggling for survival, and a creature called Gravis from a race called the Tractors, who has control over gravity and intends to turn the planet into a giant spaceship in a bid to spread his race across the universe. An unnerving story from former script editor Christopher H. Bidmead, Frontiers is one of those prime examples where everything doesn't feel safe, even with the presence of the Doctor. In the story, the TARDIS seemingly gets destroyed by a meteor shower. People get swallowed up into the ground and used to operate a machine. An alien that has the ability to control gravity can make you do whatever they want. On top of this, you have Turlough spending a portion of the story seemingly suffering from some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, having experienced the Retractors on his home planet. Resurrection of the Daleks finally sees the Fifth Doctor come face to face with his long-standing adversary, which as a story feels like the biggest hint out of all of Season 21's offerings about which direction the show was heading in. First of all, the story was re-edited from the conventional 4 25-minute episodes into 2 45-minute episodes, which was done to free up space for the broadcasting of the Winter Olympics, but must have had some resonance on the BBC hierarchy, as this was to be the format for the Sixth Doctor's first season. But most importantly is the general narrative tone. Although the Daleks and their creator Davros are the main antagonists, there is the introduction of the mercenary Lytton, who is in league with the Daleks in this story, and will later appear in Season 22's Attack of the Cybermen. The level of violence is quite high for a Doctor Who story, with it opening with a massacre of escaped prisoners on the back streets of London after being gunned down by Lytton and his henchmen disguised as police officers, an unsettling shock horror tactic that harks back to the similar themes carried out in the early 70s of Doctor Who. The on-screen death count is one of the highest of any Doctor Who story, and in the end, not much of the guest cast are left alive. This has a profound effect on Tegan, who by the story's conclusion confesses that the violence has become too much, and offers very little in the way of a goodbye to the Doctor and Turlough as she leaves in tears. An abrupt departure that in hindsight you could see coming from one of the Doctor Who's longest-serving companions. Whilst Resurrection of the Daleks is a bit of a flawed story, in particular script editor and writer Eric Saywood seemingly attempting to pack in too many narrative strands, it does play a significant role setting it in Doctor Who's new direction. The penultimate story of the Peter Davison era is Planet of Fire, and is a lot lighter in tone. However, like Resurrection of the Daleks, it attempts to cram in a lot of narrative strands, but feels like it does it slightly more subtly, as the Doctor battles the Master once more amongst the backdrop of Lanzarote as a filming location. The main difference being it ultimately serves as a narrative that ties up the story of Turlough and Chameleon, who both depart, as well as the introduction of Perry, a botanist student from America, who ends up in the TARDIS when Turlough saves her from drowning. Turlough's exit comes across as almost a relief to the Doctor, with a companion finding out he is free to return to his own planet, having turned out to be a refugee. A companion who you never failed the Doctor truly trusted despite his rejection of the Black Guardian, and someone you feel the Doctor had little choice to take under his wing. Chameleon's exit, who hadn't actually appeared since he was introduced in the King's Demons, was rightfully written out given the failed experiment nature of the prop. With the android prone to the Master's powers, it requests that the Doctor destroys it, so it can no longer be a threat or a nuisance to the Time Lord. Unlike previous companions from the Fifth Doctor era, Perry seemingly has a less troubled background. Introduced as having a seemingly abrasive relationship with her stepfather Howard, who wants to keep her on his yacht when she informs him of her intention to travel to North Africa, her actions are born more out of being a rebellious teen, although later novels allude to a more dark relationship with her stepfather, and ultimately her personality is designed to be conflicting with the incoming Sixth Doctor's persona, as opposed to the Fifth Doctor, who nevertheless reluctantly agrees to take her on board the TARDIS by the end of the story. The final story of the Fifth Doctor era is The Caves of Androzani, and is arguably the most fitting final story for a Doctor, as well as being one of the greatest stories of the classic era. The return of veteran writer Robert Holmes certainly gives the script, narrative and characters a richness that stands head and shoulders amongst virtually all the other Fifth Doctor era stories. Despite never having written for the Fifth Doctor before, Holmes, with the backing of Eric Saywood and John Nathan Turner, keys into all the characteristic traits of the Fifth Doctor, successfully builds the narrative up around them. The Doctor's curiosity into exploring the barren mining planet of Androzani Minor leads him and Perry not only to be captured by the army and sentenced to death as accused gun runners, but accidentally contracting Spectrox toxemia. In the midst of a battle between the private army, arms dealer cum Spectrox supplier Cyrus Jack, and abandoned mercenaries funded by the rich Morgus, the Doctor ultimately makes the sacrifice of his own life in order to obtain a vaccine for Perry, a companion who the Doctor is still getting to know, doesn't necessarily get on with, but nevertheless accepts the responsibility of showing the universe, which ultimately put her life at risk, and it's his duty to save Perry's life. The Fifth Doctor's vulnerability and indecisive nature runs through the narrative as times he feels he's out of his options to get himself and his companion out of the scenario, and ploughs through the narrative more through fortune than intellect. Even with Perry eventually saved and the pair back in the sanctuary of the TARDIS, there is a degree of doubt whether the Doctor feels he will regenerate, with his admittance of the situation feeling different as he succumbs to the effects of Spectrox toxemia. As the regeneration process begins, the Doctor has visions of all his previous companions from the era, and despite his possible vulnerability influencing the path of these companions, they ultimately acknowledge the role he plays in defeating evil in the universe and the sacrifices he makes along the way, even if his companions got compromised in the crossfire. It is fitting that the final companion to appear in the vision is Adric, the companion who ultimately lost his life by getting involved with the Doctor. It is also fitting that the Time Lord's last word is Adric, before being presented with an apparition of the Master, willing the Doctor to die before the regeneration begins, and before you know it, the Fifth Doctor era is over, and the Sixth Doctor era has begun. The Fifth Doctor era is, in my opinion, somewhat underrated. John Nathan Turner, throughout his leadership of the show, often took risks, with a lot of them grating against Doctor Who fandom. To some, the character design of the Fifth Doctor falls into this category, with his youthful figure coupled with his vulnerability and sometimes naive decision-making, going against a lot of what up until that point the Doctor had stood for. However, to me, had the production team and Peter Davison decided to go with another William Hartnell, Patrick Troughton, John Pertwee or Tom Baker as the character of the Fifth Doctor, the results would have been disastrous. Additionally, I feel that the characteristic differences from his predecessor makes the Fifth Doctor the ideal follow-up to the Fourth due to their variances. In terms of this era's narrative structure and some of the characterizations, this is arguably the first time Doctor Who has massively leaned on its history, with references to the past and the re-emergence of classic antagonists, as well as some of the Doctor's old friends. This is something John Nathan Turner was an advocate of, despite his desire to keep refreshing and updating the show. He ultimately simultaneously established a continuity for the show to maintain the interest of long-standing fans, whilst trying to attract newer audiences. While it is reassuring for an audience to have a hero who saves everyone and always has the ability to stop his antagonists, it can become repetitive and predictable. With the uncertainty of the Fifth Doctor, it adds a unique degree of tension for the audience as the safety blanket of certain characters is removed due to the Doctor at times not making the right decision and his curiosity getting him and his companions in trouble, sometimes in irreversible ways. This uncertainty, though, I feel only works based on the stories that fit in, particularly when the show flirted with a darker tone of narratives, which is why it's no surprise that Earthshock and the Caves of Androzani are seen by many as the standout stories of the era. If the narrative isn't dark in tone, then you need to be imaginative in this era, with such stories as Castrovalva, Kinder, Enlightenment, and the Five Doctors being prime examples. Unfortunately, those that don't fit into either of these categories feel either too safe or underwhelming, which in the end lends itself as examples for those who are critical of the Fifth Doctor era. Had there been more dark or imaginative stories, then to me Peter Davison's tenure as the Doctor would be more highly regarded. Like the character of the Fifth Doctor, the companions of this era also split audience opinion. In a similar vein to the Doctor, they all hold a degree of vulnerability or troubled persona, which once again contrasts against some of the companions that preceded them. However, their presence complements the Fifth Doctor, and at times, when they are more central to the narrative, there are some of the most memorable moments of this era of Doctor Who, regardless of the actual character. When John Nathan Turner took over as producer of Doctor Who in 1980, his new broom philosophy, coupled with his criticism of poor stories blamed on the lack of budget, was a welcome breath of fresh air for the show. However, by the end of the Fifth Doctor era, you feel his tenure was starting to fall victim of his initial criticisms, in particular stories like Time Flight and Warriors of the Deep. Many feel the time would have been right for him to move on following the conclusion of the Fifth Doctor era. However, he would carry on overseeing the Sixth and Seventh Doctor eras, and ultimately the show's cancellation, and to this day, he is the producer that splits fans most for the classic era. The Fifth Doctor's influence, you could argue, came a lot later in Doctor Who, and particularly with the post-2005 series, with the production team often swaying for a younger actor in the role. But additionally, some of the most recent Doctors have shown similar signs of vulnerability for their decision-making, which you could argue have had a more profound effect on the companions. But what do you think of the Fifth Doctor? An underrated era of Doctor Who, or the start of the depreciation of the classic series? Let me know in the comments below. But for now, it's the end. But the moment has been prepared for.